You know, silk can be really intimidating for a lot of people, but it actually isn't. And if you know the ingredients, and there are a couple of little ingredients in the setup and the kinds of threads and the needles you use, and once you do that, it's home free. So let's talk about the needles, because they are very, very important. Now, when you're choosing needles, the thing to remember is, on the bottom, we have the needle sizes. All right, and that's the bigger the number, the bigger the needle, and we want a smaller needle, a 60, a 70, or 65. Now, beside that is another little number that says a 9. You can look at either one. It's 65 is the same thing as a 9. And then up here we have the letters. See, HM, H, HJ. That's the kind of point. And those 3 points are very sharp and they're very good for sewing on silk. But remember, it has to be the right size. Now, the next thing that's really important with sewing on silk is the kind of thread. Polyester thread always has a little bit of stretch. This is cotton thread, and cotton thread will not stretch. And I think I prefer cotton thread whenever I sew on silk, on the top and the bottom. And so we'll sew on that. Now, there are 2 weights of thread. If you sew with the 70 needle, you can use if you sew with the 70, you can use the regular weight thread. But if you sew with the 60 or 65, you have to use one called embroidery. And that's just a little finer thread. And the reason is it'll go through the needle. The thicker thread will go through the 65 and the 60 needle, but it won't sew for very long. It'll keep breaking. Now, the next thing is, for interfacing, I prefer silk organza because I don't like to use fusibles right on silk charmeuse, any of these kind of slippery, liquidy silks, because then they get bubbly. Whereas you could use it on, the blouse I have on is silk shantung, and that's fine because that's a rougher weave, but not on these liquidy ones. You want to use silk organza. Now, some silks are very difficult to cut out, and you know those, like chiffons and some of the real slippery ones, they slide all over the table. So what I do before I start is I put paper on the table, then I layer the fabric double thickness, and then I lay my pattern on top of it. And when I cut it out, I actually cut right through the paper. If you'll look at this, here's my pattern, here are my 2 layers of silk, and there's the paper. It doesn't have to be tissue paper, it could be any kind. Then I'll just throw that away. But what that does is that keeps it from shifting so I can get a really accurate cutting line. Otherwise, that underneath layer tends to want to scoot up. Now, to sew with silk, one of the things you might want to check on are your pins. If your pins are very dull, you might want to get some new ones because you don't want to cause any snagging. You want them to slip in very easily. And I know they have silk pins, but they're so little I don't use them very often because I can't see them. But I just want to make sure that the ends are not dull. Now, I've got it right sides together, and I'm going to begin to sew it. My stitch length is a straight stitch, and it's about 2 in width, or 2.5. Let's begin to sew. Now, you don't want to pull the seam. If it's a kind of a curved seam, you don't want to pull it because you're going to stretch it. But on the other hand, what I like to do is I kind of flattening it out as I sew. You see how I sew with my hand in a little V. And I guide with this hand, but I'm not stretching it in any way. Now, we can take a look at this from behind. And you can see how there is not any puckering on that seam, and that's what you want. So your next thing would be to merely press it. So what I always do is press it as stitched and then press it open like this. Now I can press this with steam because this silk has been pre-shrunk. And I did that by just washing it, hand washing it in shampoo. But my initial pressing was as it was stitched. And so that's what you're looking for. So that's the story on silk. And remember, if you pre-shrink your silk in the beginning by just hand washing it by hand and then just rinsing it out and letting it hang over the shower pole, then from then on you can actually launder it yourself. And the best thing to do silk garments and silk fabric in is hair shampoo. And if you want to lock in the color, you use shampoo for color-treated hair.